The day I discovered the secret bank account started like the quietest day of my life and ended as the day everything I believed about my marriage began to fall apart. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 61 years old, retired, and until last spring I believed I had lived a fairly ordinary life. For 36 years I was married to the same woman, a woman I trusted with everything I had. Her name was Laura. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, and for the first few weeks after the funeral my world felt like a house where all the lights had been turned off at once. When you spend more than half your life with someone, silence becomes a strange companion. Every room reminds you of the person who used to fill it with ordinary sounds, a coffee mug touching the kitchen counter, footsteps in the hallway, the quiet hum of a voice on the phone with a friend. After the funeral our daughter Emily stayed with me for a few days, trying to help organize paperwork and make sure I ate something other than toast. But eventually she had to go back to Chicago, back to her job, back to her own life. When she left, the house became unbearably quiet. That's when I started going through Laura's things. At first it was simple tasks, sorting clothes, organizing old photo albums, opening drawers that had not been touched in years. I told myself I was doing it to keep busy, but the truth is I was also searching for pieces of her that I didn't want to lose. Laura had always been organized, the kind of person who kept receipts from 10 years ago and knew exactly which folder contained the warranty for every appliance in the house. So when I found the small metal box hidden behind a stack of tax documents in the back of her desk drawer, I assumed it was just another place she kept important papers. The box wasn't locked, but it was tucked so far into the drawer that it almost seemed intentionally hidden. Inside were several envelopes, a few old photographs, and a bank statement. At first the statement didn't seem unusual. Then I noticed something that made me pause. The bank name printed at the top wasn't the one Laura and I had used for decades. It was from a different bank across town, one I had never visited and never even heard Laura mention. I sat down in her desk chair and looked closer. The statement showed a balance that made my stomach tighten slightly. $347,000. For several seconds I simply stared at the number, trying to understand what I was looking at. Laura and I had always been comfortable but never wealthy. Our savings account, the one we had built together over the years, contained nowhere near that amount. And yet here, on this piece of paper, was proof that my wife had been quietly holding a fortune I knew nothing about. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Maybe it was an old account she forgot to close, I thought. Maybe it belonged to someone else and the statement had been sent to the wrong address. But as I flipped through the rest of the envelopes in the metal box, I found more statements. Dozens of them, carefully organized by year. The account had existed for at least 12 years. I leaned back in the chair, feeling a strange sensation in my chest. Laura and I had shared everything for more than 3 decades. Every mortgage payment, every medical bill, every financial decision had been something we discussed together. Or at least that's what I believed. Yet somehow my wife had been quietly managing an account worth hundreds of thousands of dollars without ever mentioning it once. I spent the next hour reading every statement in the box. The deposits were consistent, almost mechanical. Every month money had been transferred into the account from somewhere else. Sometimes the amount was $2,000, sometimes $5,000, occasionally even more. But the part that truly unsettled me wasn't the deposits. It was the withdrawals. Because every few months, like clockwork, a large sum would leave the account. $10,000. Sometimes 15. Once, nearly 20. And each time the description next to the withdrawal contained the same vague phrase, transfer authorized in person. I closed the folder slowly and rubbed my forehead, trying to make sense of it. Laura had never been careless with money. She tracked every expense in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. She compared grocery prices, clipped coupons, and once spent 3 weeks researching the best interest rate for a savings bond. So why would a woman like that hide nearly $500,000 from her own husband? That night I barely slept. The metal box sat on the kitchen table like a quiet accusation. I kept replaying memories of our life together, searching for moments when Laura might have hinted at something unusual. But nothing came to mind. She had always been warm, attentive, sometimes even overly honest about small things like forgetting to mail a bill or misplacing the car keys. Secrets had never seemed like part of her nature. The next morning I drove across town to the bank listed on the statement. The building was smaller than I expected, a brick structure squeezed between a pharmacy and a coffee shop. Inside, a young woman behind the counter greeted me politely and asked how she could help. I explained that my wife had recently passed away and that I had discovered an account in her name. The woman's expression softened immediately. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said gently before asking for identification and the documents I had brought with me. She disappeared into a back office for several minutes while I sat in a chair near the window, watching people walk past outside. When she returned, her tone had changed slightly. "Mr. Harper," she said carefully, "this account is listed as private. There's a note in the system indicating that withdrawals were authorized only by the account holder in person." "That was my wife," I said. She nodded. "Yes, sir. But there's also another note." I felt a small tension form in my chest. "What kind of note?" The woman glanced at the screen again before answering. "It says the funds were intended for someone specific." My mind raced through possibilities. A charity, perhaps. A secret investment. Some complicated financial arrangement Laura had simply forgotten to explain. "Who?" I asked. The woman hesitated. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "But the note also says the identity of the recipient should only be revealed under certain circumstances." "What circumstances?" She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "If the person came to claim it." For a moment the words didn't fully register. "You're saying someone was supposed to collect this money?" "Yes, sir." "Who?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But according to the records, your wife believed that one day, they would." I left the bank feeling as though I had stepped into someone else's story. My wife had spent 12 years quietly saving hundreds of thousands of dollars for a person she never told me about. And somewhere out there, according to the bank's records, that person might still be waiting. What I didn't know yet was that the search for that person would take me deep into parts of Laura's past she had carefully hidden for decades. Parts that would force me to question not only my marriage, but the very life I thought we had built together. For the rest of that day I walked through the house like a man who had discovered a hidden door in a place he thought he knew perfectly. Every object suddenly seemed suspicious in a quiet way, as if ordinary things might be hiding pieces of a story I had somehow missed for decades. Laura's favorite chair near the window, the small ceramic bowl where she kept her keys, the stack of cookbooks she insisted on keeping even though she only used 2 of them regularly. Nothing had physically changed, yet the meaning behind everything felt slightly different now that I knew she had been keeping something so significant from me. That night I placed the metal box back on the kitchen table and began studying the bank statements again more carefully, this time not just looking at the balance or the withdrawals but searching for patterns in the dates. At first nothing stood out. The deposits appeared almost mechanical, arriving around the same time each month as if scheduled automatically. But the withdrawals were different. They happened only a few times a year, and when I aligned the dates on a piece of paper I noticed something strange. Many of them occurred in late October or early November. I sat back in my chair and stared at the calendar on the wall across the kitchen. Late October had always been a quiet time in our house. No birthdays, no holidays, nothing particularly memorable except one small detail that suddenly returned to my mind with unexpected clarity. Every year around that time Laura used to take a short trip for a few days. She always described it as visiting an old friend from college. The trips never seemed suspicious because they were brief and predictable. She would pack a small suitcase, drive out of town on a Friday morning, and return Sunday evening looking tired but peaceful. I had always assumed it was her way of maintaining a friendship from her younger years. But now, staring at the dates of those withdrawals, a cold thought began to form in my mind. What if those trips had something to do with the money? The idea felt uncomfortable, yet it also explained something that had puzzled me quietly for years. Laura rarely talked about that friend. She mentioned her name only once or twice, and whenever I asked questions she would answer politely but quickly change the subject. At the time I assumed it was simply a friendship that belonged to a different chapter of her life. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning I returned to the bank. This time I asked to speak with the branch manager, a man in his 50s named Mr. Collins who had apparently worked there for nearly 20 years. When I explained the situation again and showed him the statements from the metal box, he listened carefully before leaning back in his chair. "Your wife opened this account about 12 years ago," he said slowly, scrolling through information on his computer. "She was very particular about the privacy settings. She didn't want the account connected to any other financial records." I nodded, though that detail didn't surprise me anymore. What I wanted to know was something else entirely. "Did she ever come here with someone?" I asked. Mr. Collins hesitated for a moment before answering. "Occasionally," he admitted. "But not often." My chest tightened slightly. "Who was it?" He looked at the screen again before speaking. "A young man," he said. "Probably in his 20s the first time I saw him. Quiet. Polite." The words echoed inside my head in a way that felt strangely unsettling. "Do you know his name?" I asked. Mr. Collins shook his head slowly. "Your wife never introduced him. But she always handled the paperwork herself. The young man mostly waited in the lobby." I leaned forward slightly in my chair. "Did he ever withdraw money from the account?" Mr. Collins shook his head again. "No. Every withdrawal was done by your wife personally." When I left the bank for the second time that week, the mystery surrounding Laura's secret account had become even more complicated. Not only had she been saving money for someone I didn't know, but she had also brought that person to the bank at least once. The idea that a stranger had quietly entered a building connected to my wife's hidden life made my stomach feel heavy in a way I couldn't easily explain. That evening I drove to the small storage unit Laura had rented years earlier. It was something we rarely talked about, mostly because she insisted it contained nothing more than old furniture and boxes from when we moved houses. But after discovering the metal box in her desk, I found myself wondering whether that storage space might contain more pieces of the story she never told me. The building stood on the edge of town near a row of abandoned warehouses, its long metal corridors smelling faintly of dust and cardboard. I unlocked the unit with the key Laura kept on her keychain and slowly rolled the metal door upward. Inside were exactly the kinds of things she had described: an old dresser, several boxes of books, and a stack of photo albums from our early years of marriage. For a moment I felt almost embarrassed for suspecting anything unusual. Then I noticed a small suitcase sitting behind the dresser, partially hidden from view. It was one I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I found several envelopes neatly arranged inside, along with something that made my breath catch in my throat. A photograph. It showed Laura standing beside a young boy who looked no older than 10 or 11. They were standing in front of what appeared to be a small house somewhere in the countryside. Laura's arm rested gently on the boy's shoulder, and both of them were smiling at the camera in a way that suggested familiarity, even affection. But I had never seen the boy before. I sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit and stared at the photograph for several minutes, trying to reconcile the image with the woman I believed I knew better than anyone else in the world. Laura and I had only one child, our daughter Emily. That had always been part of our shared story, something we discussed openly whenever friends talked about raising children. Yet here was a picture of my wife standing beside a boy who clearly meant something to her. Inside one of the envelopes I found a handwritten note in Laura's careful script. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, but the words were still easy to read. If anything ever happens to me, the money is for him. He deserves a chance at the life I couldn't give him. My hands began to tremble slightly as I read the sentence again. For him. Not charity. Not an investment. A person. Somewhere in the past Laura had known a boy well enough to save nearly $500,000 for him over more than a decade. And somehow, during 36 years of marriage, she had never told me he existed. As I sat there holding the photograph under the dim light of the storage unit, another question slowly began to take shape in my mind. The young man the bank manager mentioned. The boy in the photograph. The annual withdrawals in October. They might all be connected. What I didn't know yet was that following those connections would lead me to a small town nearly 3 hours away, a place Laura had visited many times without ever telling me why. And waiting in that town was someone whose existence would force me to confront the most difficult question of all. Who had my wife really been before she met me? For a long time I remained sitting on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit holding the photograph in both hands, studying the boy's face as if the answer to everything might somehow appear if I looked long enough. The resemblance to anyone I knew wasn't obvious, but there was something strangely familiar about the shape of his eyes, the way his smile tilted slightly to one side. It wasn't the kind of familiarity that brings recognition immediately. It was subtler than that, the uneasy feeling you get when you see a stranger who somehow reminds you of someone you've known for years. Eventually I placed the photograph carefully back into the envelope along with the note Laura had written and closed the suitcase again. My heart was beating slowly but heavily, the way it does when your mind has begun assembling pieces of a puzzle you're not entirely ready to see completed. The drive home that evening felt longer than usual. Every mile seemed to add another question to the growing list inside my head. If the boy in the photograph had meant enough to Laura for her to secretly save hundreds of thousands of dollars, then he must have been someone extremely important to her. A relative, perhaps. But if that were the case, why hide him from me? Laura had always been close with her extended family. I knew her cousins, her aunt in Colorado, even the elderly neighbor who had helped raise her when she was a child. None of them had ever mentioned a boy like the one in that photograph. When I arrived home I placed the suitcase on the kitchen table beside the metal box and began spreading everything out in front of me like evidence in a case I had never intended to investigate. There were more photographs tucked inside the envelopes, most of them taken years apart but clearly showing the same boy growing older. In one he looked about 12, standing beside a bicycle with Laura crouched next to him smiling proudly. In another he was perhaps 16, taller now, wearing a baseball cap and standing outside what appeared to be a modest house. Each photograph told a silent story of visits that had happened somewhere beyond the edges of my life. Visits Laura had made during those mysterious October weekends. The more I studied the pictures the more one detail began to trouble me. In several of them Laura looked younger than I expected for the timeline I had imagined. If the account had been opened 12 years ago, then the earliest photographs should have matched that period. But some of the images looked older, perhaps 15 or even 18 years old. That meant Laura's connection to the boy went back even further than the secret bank account. I leaned back in the chair and tried to imagine what her life might have looked like before we met. Laura and I had married quickly after meeting in our late 20s. Our conversations about the past had always been casual, filled with harmless stories about college, first apartments, and the jobs we held before settling down. She had never mentioned a child. Yet the possibility began creeping into my thoughts whether I wanted it there or not. Could the boy in the photographs be hers? The idea felt almost impossible, but once it appeared in my mind it refused to leave. Late that night I opened my laptop and began searching through old records connected to the town listed on the back of one of the photographs. It was a small place called Millfield, a quiet rural community a few hours north that I had never visited. The internet revealed very little beyond a few local businesses and a small high school that served most of the surrounding farmland. I stared at the screen for several minutes before finally making a decision that felt both inevitable and strangely unsettling. The next morning I packed a small overnight bag and started driving. The highway stretched through miles of open countryside, and as the city gradually faded behind me I found my thoughts drifting back through the years of my marriage with Laura. There had been many quiet moments that now seemed worth reconsidering. Her October trips, the occasional sadness in her eyes after returning from them, the way she sometimes stood by the kitchen window late at night staring into the darkness as if thinking about something she could never quite bring herself to say out loud. At the time I assumed those moments were simply part of the complexity of life, the small private thoughts everyone carries inside themselves. Now they felt like fragments of a larger truth that had been waiting patiently for me to notice. I arrived in Millfield just after noon. The town was exactly the kind of place you might imagine from its name: a handful of streets, a grocery store, a diner with a faded red sign, and a row of houses surrounded by wide stretches of farmland. It was the sort of place where strangers are noticed immediately. I parked outside the diner and went inside, hoping that someone there might recognize Laura from the photographs. The waitress who greeted me looked to be in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and the calm expression of someone who had seen generations of customers come and go. I ordered coffee and waited until the diner had quieted slightly before sliding one of the photographs across the counter. "Do you recognize this woman?" I asked. The waitress studied the picture carefully, her brow furrowing slightly as she examined Laura's face. After a moment she nodded. "Yes," she said slowly. "That's Laura Bennett." The name startled me. Laura had always used my last name after we married, but Bennett was the one she was born with. "You knew her?" I asked. "She used to visit every year," the waitress replied. "Always around October. Stayed for a few days, usually with the Harris family outside town." My pulse quickened slightly. "The Harris family?" She nodded again. "Nice people. The boy especially. Quiet kid, but polite." I hesitated before asking the question that had been building inside my chest ever since I saw the photographs. Was Laura related to him? The waitress tilted her head slightly, studying my face as if trying to understand why I was asking. "Well," she said slowly, "she wasn't exactly his aunt." I leaned forward slightly. "Then what was she?" The waitress hesitated for several seconds before answering, as though the truth she was about to share belonged to a story she assumed everyone already knew. "She was his mother." The words settled into the air between us with a quiet finality. For a moment I couldn't respond. My mind tried to reject the statement automatically, to push it aside as a misunderstanding. But the photographs, the secret account, the annual visits, everything I had discovered over the past few days suddenly aligned with a clarity that made denial impossible. Laura had a son. And for 36 years of marriage, she had never told me he existed. I sat there for a moment longer after the waitress said those words, feeling the world around me slow down in that strange way it sometimes does when a truth arrives that you are not prepared to carry. The diner hadn't changed, the coffee was still warm in my hands, the same country music hummed quietly from an old speaker above the counter, yet inside my mind something had shifted so dramatically that the ordinary sounds of the room seemed to belong to someone else's life. Laura had a son. I repeated this sentence silently several times, trying to imagine the version of my wife who had once lived in this small town before I ever knew her. For 36 years I believed I understood the outline of her life before we met, yet somehow an entire child had existed outside that story. The waitress noticed the way I stared at the photograph and asked gently if everything was all right. I realized I had not answered her last question, so I forced myself to speak calmly even though my chest felt tight. I asked her if the Harris family still lived nearby. She nodded and explained that the house was about 10 minutes outside town along a gravel road near a stretch of farmland that had been in their family for decades. When she gave me directions I thanked her, left some money for the coffee, and walked out of the diner feeling like someone stepping into the second half of a life he didn't recognize. The road leading to the Harris house wound through wide open fields where the wind pushed softly against rows of dry grass. As I drove, I tried to imagine Laura traveling this same route year after year, quietly visiting a son she had never mentioned to her husband. The thought was painful, not only because of the secrecy but because it forced me to reconsider the woman I had loved for most of my adult life. Had she been living two separate versions of herself all those years? One in the house we shared, another here in this quiet town where a boy grew into a young man knowing her as his mother while I remained unaware of his existence. The Harris house appeared at the end of a narrow driveway surrounded by tall maple trees. It was a modest farmhouse with white siding that had faded slightly with age. A pickup truck sat near the porch, and for a moment I considered turning the car around and driving back to the city before anyone noticed I was there. But something inside me refused to leave without seeing the truth face to face. I parked the car, stepped out into the cool afternoon air, and walked toward the front door. Before I could knock, the door opened. The man standing there looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most. He was taller than I expected, with dark hair and steady eyes that studied me with cautious curiosity. In that instant I recognized him immediately even though we had never met. His face had matured since the photographs I found in the suitcase, but the resemblance was unmistakable. "You must be Daniel," he said quietly. The fact that he knew my name stopped me mid-step. For several seconds I couldn't respond because my mind was trying to process how the stranger in front of me had anticipated my arrival. "You knew I'd come?" I finally asked. He nodded once and stepped aside to let me enter the house. "I figured it would happen eventually," he said. His voice was calm, almost patient, as if he had been rehearsing this moment for years. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood and fresh coffee. The living room contained simple furniture and a bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks. On the wall near the staircase hung several framed photographs, including one of Laura standing beside the same boy I had seen in the picture from the suitcase. "I'm Aaron," he said as we sat down across from each other at the kitchen table. The name felt strangely heavy as it settled into the conversation. "Aaron. My wife's son." For a moment neither of us spoke. I studied his face carefully, searching for traces of Laura that I might have overlooked in the photographs. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile when he briefly looked down at the table, even the way he folded his hands in front of him reminded me of her in subtle ways that now seemed obvious. "You probably have a lot of questions," Aaron said finally. "That's one way to put it," I replied. He nodded again, accepting the weight of the situation without defensiveness. "She always wondered when this day would come," he said quietly. The sentence made my chest tighten. "You knew about me?" "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "She told me about you many years ago." The room felt very still in that moment. I asked the question that had been pressing against my thoughts since the waitress at the diner spoke the word mother. I asked him why Laura had never told me about him. Aaron leaned back slightly in his chair before answering. Because she believed it would destroy the life she built with you. The explanation sounded simple, but the meaning behind it carried decades of emotion I was only beginning to understand. He told me that Laura had been very young when he was born. The circumstances surrounding his birth were complicated, tied to a relationship that ended badly before she met me. At the time she had been struggling financially and emotionally, and the Harris family, distant relatives on her mother's side, had agreed to help raise him. Laura visited whenever she could, especially during the early years, but as time passed the arrangement became more complicated. She didn't want you to feel like she had hidden something from the beginning, Aaron continued. So she kept waiting for the right moment to tell you. I felt a bitter smile form briefly on my face. And the right moment never came. Aaron shook his head slowly. She thought about it many times. I know that much. But every year that passed made it harder. For a long time we sat there in silence. The anger I expected to feel toward the young man across the table never appeared. Instead, what I felt was a quiet sadness, not only for the secret Laura had kept but for the years Aaron had lived knowing his mother belonged partly to another life. Eventually he stood up and walked toward a cabinet near the kitchen sink. When he returned he placed a small envelope on the table between us. Inside was a single folded piece of paper written in Laura's unmistakable handwriting. She asked me to give this to you if you ever came looking, Aaron said. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the letter. The message was short, written with the same careful script I had seen in the note from the suitcase. Daniel, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally reached you. I wanted to tell you so many times, but every year that passed made the words harder to say. Aaron was born during a chapter of my life I believed had ended before I met you. When you and I started building our life together, I convinced myself that protecting what we had meant leaving that part of the past behind. But a mother never truly leaves her child behind. The money I saved was never meant to replace the years I missed. It was meant to give him the opportunities one couldn't provide when he was young. I know this secret may feel like a betrayal, and perhaps in some ways it is. But everything I built with you was real. Every day of our life together mattered to me more than I ever managed to say out loud. I finished reading the letter and placed it carefully back on the table. For several seconds neither Aaron nor I spoke. Finally he said something that surprised me. She loved you very much. I looked at the photograph on the wall again, then back at the young man sitting across from me. In that moment I understood something that had been hidden inside the story from the beginning. Laura had not lived two separate lives the way I had imagined during the drive to Millfield. She had lived one life that simply contained more complexity than I had ever realized. And somewhere within that complexity was a son who had grown up waiting quietly in the background of our marriage, never asking for recognition, never demanding a place in the world his mother had built somewhere else. For a while after finishing the letter neither of us spoke, and the silence inside that small farmhouse kitchen felt strangely peaceful compared to the storm of thoughts moving through my mind. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then rested my hands on the table as I studied Aaron's face again, trying to reconcile the young man sitting across from me with the decades of my life that had passed without knowing he existed. What surprised me most was not anger but a deep sense of disorientation, as if the map of my past had suddenly been redrawn without warning. I had spent 36 years believing my marriage to Laura contained no hidden chapters, yet here I was sitting across from her son in a town I had never visited, holding a letter she wrote years ago in case the truth ever reached me. Aaron eventually broke the silence by asking if I wanted coffee, and the simple normalcy of the question made the situation feel even more surreal. I nodded, And he moved around the kitchen with an easy familiarity that told me he had spent most of his life in this house. As he poured the coffee into 2 mugs, I noticed more photographs along the hallway wall, some of them showing him as a teenager, others taken more recently. In several of them Laura stood beside him with the same quiet smile she used whenever she posed for family pictures with Emily and me. Seeing those images together created a strange overlap between 2 versions of her life, like 2 stories printed on the same page. When Aaron returned to the table with the coffee, he sat down and looked at me thoughtfully before speaking again. He told me that Laura had visited every year without fail since he was a child. Sometimes she stayed only a day or 2, sometimes a little longer, but she always came in October because that was when his birthday fell. The annual withdrawals from the bank account suddenly made sense in a way that tightened my chest. The money had not been random at all. It had been her way of contributing to his life from a distance, helping pay for school supplies when he was young, helping with college later on, and eventually setting aside a future she believed he deserved. Aaron explained that the Harris family had raised him as their own because Laura had been struggling when he was born. She had been working 2 jobs at the time and living in a small apartment while trying to finish a degree. According to him, she had intended to bring him back into her life once things stabilized, but circumstances kept shifting in ways that made that plan harder each year. Then she met me. As he said my name, I felt the weight of the timeline settle into place. By the time Laura and I married, Aaron was already a small child living in this quiet town, and revealing his existence would have required her to explain a complicated past she was afraid might destroy the future she was trying to build. Listening to him describe those years made me realize how easily life can branch into paths we never see. From my perspective, Laura's early adulthood had seemed straightforward: a few jobs, some college classes, a short relationship that ended before we met. Yet hidden within that same period was the beginning of Aaron's life and the difficult decision that followed. I asked him if he had ever wanted to meet me before now. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, but he answered honestly. He said there had been times when he was younger when curiosity made him wonder about the man his mother married, but Laura had always explained that revealing the truth too soon might cause more harm than good. As he grew older, he learned to accept the unusual arrangement for what it was, a relationship that existed quietly on the edges of another family's story. At some point during the conversation, Aaron asked about Emily, the daughter Laura and I raised together. I told him she was doing well in Chicago, working as an architect and recently engaged to a man she met through work. When he heard that, a brief smile appeared on his face, and I realized that he had probably imagined his half-sister many times without ever meeting her. The thought created another wave of emotion I hadn't expected. My wife had given birth to 2 children who had grown up unaware of each other's existence, living separate lives that might have intersected many years earlier under different circumstances. Eventually Aaron stood up and walked to the living room, returning with a small wooden box. He placed it gently on the table between us and opened the lid. Inside were dozens of letters, each carefully folded and dated in Laura's handwriting. He explained that she had written to him often during the years when she couldn't visit as frequently as she wanted. The letters described small pieces of her life with me, holidays we celebrated, trips we took, stories about Emily growing up. Reading them had helped Aaron feel connected to the part of his mother's world that existed far away from Millfield. As he spoke, I realized that Laura had not erased one life in favor of another the way I initially feared. Instead, she had been trying to hold both lives together quietly, balancing them with the fragile hope that someday the truth might surface in a way that did not destroy either side. As the afternoon sunlight shifted across the kitchen floor, I began to feel the heavy knot of anger that followed me on the drive here slowly loosen. The secrecy still hurt, and I knew it always would, but the deeper I stepped into the story, the more I understood that Laura's choices had not been driven by indifference or betrayal. They had been shaped by fear, responsibility, and the complicated reality of loving 2 children whose worlds were never meant to collide. Before I left the house that evening, Aaron walked with me to the driveway. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the tall maple trees around the property. For a moment we simply stood beside my car without speaking. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. He told me that Laura had always described me as the best decision she ever made. According to him, she believed marrying me had given her the stability she needed to rebuild her life after the chaos of her early 20s. Hearing those words from her son, the child I had never known existed, created a quiet ache in my chest that felt very different from anger. When I finally started the drive back toward the city, the sun was already lowering behind the fields, casting long shadows across the road. I realized that the secret bank account I discovered days earlier had not been evidence of betrayal in the way I first imagined. Instead, it had been a bridge, one Laura built carefully over 12 years to connect two halves of her life that had never met. Yet as I watched the road stretch ahead of me in the fading light, another thought slowly began to form in my mind. Emily still knew nothing about Aaron. She still believed the story of our family was exactly as she had always known it. And sooner or later, the truth waiting quietly in that farmhouse outside Millfield would have to find its way into her life as well. The highway back toward the city felt longer than the one that brought me to Millfield earlier that day. The sky was already turning orange at the edges as the sun sank low over the fields, and the quiet rhythm of the tires against the pavement gave my mind far too much space to think. Only a few days earlier I believed I was grieving a single loss, the death of my wife. Now it felt as if I was also grieving the version of our life I thought we had shared without secrets. Yet the strange thing was that the anger I expected to feel had softened into something more complicated. Laura had hidden something enormous from me, but the deeper I stepped into the truth, the more I saw how carefully she had tried to protect every piece of the life she built. The money in the secret account had not been selfish. It had not been an escape or an affair or some hidden luxury she enjoyed while I remained unaware. It had been a quiet act of responsibility, a way of supporting the son she could not raise while still honoring the marriage she had with me. By the time I reached the city, the streetlights had begun to flicker on, casting long pale reflections across the pavement. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it had the morning I left for Millfield, but the silence inside felt different now that I understood what Laura had been carrying all those years. I stepped into the kitchen and placed the envelope containing her letter on the table beside the metal box and the stack of bank statements. For several minutes I simply stood there looking at them, aware that the objects in front of me represented two separate stories that had quietly coexisted within my marriage. One was the life I knew, the shared holidays, the routines, the years spent raising Emily. The other was the life Laura had protected in the background, the one that led her back to that farmhouse each October. Eventually I poured myself a glass of water and sat down in the chair where Laura used to read in the evenings. The thought that kept returning to my mind was Emily. She had always believed her parents were straightforward people who told the truth even when it was uncomfortable. Discovering that her mother had another child somewhere in the world would shatter that simple understanding in ways I couldn't fully predict. I picked up my phone twice that night intending to call her, but each time I set it back down again. Telling her over the phone felt wrong. Some truths deserve to be spoken face to face. The next morning I woke earlier than usual and made coffee while the first light of dawn slipped through the kitchen window. After a few minutes of staring at the quiet street outside, I finally dialed Emily's number. She answered quickly, sounding slightly out of breath as if she had been rushing through her morning routine. When I asked if she could come visit for the weekend, she immediately sensed something serious in my voice. She didn't press me for details, but she agreed to drive down the following day. The hours leading up to her arrival felt strangely heavy. I spent most of them sorting through the letters Aaron had shown me, reading pieces of Laura's life written in her own careful handwriting. Some of the letters were simple descriptions of daily events, little updates about Emily's school activities or stories about our neighbors. Others were more reflective, written during moments when Laura seemed to be struggling with the weight of her decision. In one of them she wrote about standing in our kitchen late at night wondering whether honesty would destroy the family she loved or whether silence would slowly become its own kind of betrayal. Reading those words made it impossible to see her choices as simple deception. They were the result of a conflict she carried quietly for decades. Emily arrived Saturday afternoon just as the autumn sunlight began filtering through the tall trees lining our street. She stepped out of the car with the same confident energy she had always had, hugging me tightly before asking if everything was all right. We sat together in the living room where Laura used to watch television in the evenings, and for a moment I felt the familiar comfort of our ordinary family life pressing gently against the truth I was about to reveal. I began by telling Emily about the metal box and the secret bank account. At first she listened with mild confusion, assuming it was simply an investment Laura had forgotten to mention. But as I explained the trips to Millfield and the photographs I found in the storage unit, her expression gradually changed from curiosity to quiet disbelief. When I finally told her that her mother had a son named Aaron who lived 3 hours away, the room fell completely silent. Emily leaned back against the couch and stared at the floor for several seconds before speaking. Her voice was calm but distant, as if she were repeating something she had heard in a dream. She asked if the story was true, if her mother had really been visiting another child all those years. I told her everything I knew, including the letter Laura wrote and the way Aaron described their relationship. When I finished explaining, she sat quietly for a long time, absorbing the information piece by piece. Eventually she looked up at me and asked the question I had been waiting for. She asked why Laura never told us the truth. I repeated the explanation Aaron gave me, though I admitted that some parts of Laura's reasoning might never be fully understood. Emily nodded slowly, accepting the complexity of the situation in a way that reminded me very much of her mother. After another long pause she surprised me by asking if Aaron knew about her. When I told her he did, she considered that for a moment before saying something that shifted the entire tone of the conversation. She said she wanted to meet him. The simplicity of her response caught me off guard. I had prepared myself for anger or resentment, yet Emily seemed more curious than anything else. She explained that discovering she had a brother was shocking, but it didn't erase the years she spent loving her mother. If anything, she said, understanding the secret might help her see Laura more clearly as a person rather than just a parent. The following weekend we drove together back to Millfield. The road that had felt so heavy with uncertainty during my first trip now carried a different atmosphere. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat for most of the drive, occasionally asking small questions about the photographs or the letters I had read. When we reached the Harris farmhouse, Aaron was already waiting near the porch, having received my message earlier that morning. Watching the two of them meet for the first time created a moment I will never forget. They stood facing each other with the same mixture of curiosity and nervous recognition that appears when strangers realize they share something deeply personal. Aaron smiled first, offering a simple greeting, and Emily responded with a cautious warmth that quickly eased the tension between them. As they began talking on the porch, I stepped back toward the driveway, giving them space to discover each other in their own way. The late afternoon sunlight illuminated the fields behind the house, and for the first time since Laura's death I felt something inside my chest loosen into a quiet sense of resolution. The secret bank account I discovered weeks earlier had opened a door into a hidden chapter of my wife's life, but it had also revealed something else entirely. It showed me that love does not always follow the simple paths we expect. Sometimes it spreads across complicated decisions, difficult compromises, and years of silence meant to protect the people we care about. Standing there in the soft autumn light watching Emily and Aaron talk beside the farmhouse, I realized that the story Laura left behind was not just about secrecy. It was about the complicated ways a single life can hold more love than one family ever fully sees. For several minutes I stayed near the edge of the driveway watching Emily and Aaron speak to each other on the porch, their voices carried softly by the wind across the open field. At first the conversation was cautious, filled with the kind of polite questions strangers ask when they are trying to understand how they are connected. But gradually something began to change in the way they stood. Emily relaxed her shoulders, Aaron's posture shifted from guarded to open, and the distance between them shrank slightly as they talked. I could see pieces of Laura in both of them in ways that felt almost surreal now that I knew the truth. The same thoughtful pause before answering a question, the same quiet smile that appeared when they listened carefully to someone else. For years I believed those small traits belonged only to Emily, little reminders of her mother living on in her personality. Now I could see that Laura's influence had been shaping another life far away at the same time. After a while Aaron gestured toward the inside of the house and invited Emily in. They disappeared through the doorway still talking, leaving me alone beside the car with the wide countryside stretching around me. I leaned against the hood and looked out across the fields, letting the silence settle into something calmer than the tension that had filled my mind when I first arrived in Millfield days earlier. It struck me that the secret Laura carried had not just been about protecting one person or another. It had been about protecting time itself. Every year she waited to tell the truth, hoping there would eventually be a moment when revealing it wouldn't destroy the fragile balance she had built between two lives. Eventually I walked toward the porch and stepped inside the house. Emily and Aaron were sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of photographs spread out between them, many of the same pictures I had seen earlier in the suitcase and on the living room wall. Emily was laughing softly at something Aaron had just said, and the sound caught me off guard because it was the first time since Laura's funeral that I had heard genuine joy in her voice. When she noticed me standing in the doorway she waved me over and pointed to one of the photographs where Aaron was about 14 years old holding a fishing rod beside a small lake. "Mom took this picture," she said quietly, tracing the edge of the photograph with her finger. "She used to take pictures of me exactly like this when I was little." Aaron nodded with a thoughtful smile. "She always brought her camera," he said. "Even when there wasn't much happening." Hearing them talk about Laura together created an unexpected feeling inside me, something that wasn't grief exactly but a strange mixture of sadness and warmth. The two people sitting across from each other had grown up believing they were part of separate families, yet both of them carried pieces of the same woman's life in ways they were only beginning to discover. As the afternoon faded into evening we sat around the table sharing stories about Laura from both sides of her life. Aaron talked about the long walks they used to take along the dirt road behind the farmhouse when he was young, about the books she brought him every year for his birthday, about the way she always listened carefully to whatever he wanted to say even when time was short. Emily responded with memories of holidays at our house, the way Laura decorated the living room every winter, the way she insisted on cooking far more food than anyone could eat during family gatherings. Listening to those stories overlap felt like watching two halves of a puzzle slowly slide together. At one point Emily asked Aaron a question that made the room grow quiet for a moment. She asked if he had ever resented her for having the life with their mother that he didn't. Aaron considered the question carefully before answering. He explained that when he was younger there had been moments of confusion and curiosity about the family Laura described in her letters, but resentment never truly took hold. The Harris family had loved him deeply and given him a stable home, and Laura's visits each year had always felt like a gift rather than a reminder of something missing. His voice remained calm as he said this, but the honesty behind his words carried a weight that made the room feel still. Later that evening we stepped outside onto the porch again as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared above the fields. The air had grown cooler, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifted from somewhere across the valley. Emily leaned against the railing while Aaron stood beside the steps, both of them looking out at the open land the way Laura must have done during her visits here. I realized in that moment that the secret which had once divided these two lives was now slowly becoming the bridge connecting them. Before we left, Aaron handed me another envelope. Inside was a final letter Laura had written not long before she became ill, one she apparently never found the courage to send. I opened it while standing beside the car with the porch light illuminating the page. In the letter she wrote about the quiet fear she had carried for decades, the fear that the truth about Aaron would one day surface after she was gone. She explained that the secret bank account had never been meant as a replacement for honesty but as a safety net in case the world she carefully balanced finally shifted. She ended the letter with a line that stayed with me long after we left the farmhouse. She wrote that love does not always follow the paths we expect, but when it is real it finds ways to grow even in the spaces between difficult choices. During the drive back to the city, Emily sat quietly beside me, occasionally glancing at the envelope resting in my hands. After a while she spoke in a voice that sounded thoughtful rather than sad. She said that discovering Aaron had changed the way she saw her mother, but it hadn't taken away the love she felt for her. Instead it made Laura seem more human, a person who struggled with complicated decisions the same way everyone else does. As the lights of the city appeared in the distance I realized that the journey that began with a hidden bank statement had led me somewhere I never expected. It had taken me through confusion, anger, and grief, but it had also uncovered a piece of Laura's life that might otherwise have remained buried forever. The secret account that once looked like a betrayal had turned out to be something entirely different, a quiet promise she made to a son she could never stop loving and a fragile hope that someday the truth would find a way to bring everyone together rather than tear them apart. The weeks after that visit to Millfield passed more quietly than I expected, but not in the empty way the house had felt after Laura's funeral. Something about finally understanding the truth behind the secret account had shifted the atmosphere of my life in a subtle but permanent way. The grief was still there, of course. Losing someone after 36 years leaves spaces in your daily routine that never fully close. But the confusion that once surrounded Laura's memory had slowly begun to fade, replaced by a clearer picture of the woman she really was. Not perfect, not always brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered, but deeply committed to protecting the people she loved even when the cost of that protection was silence. Emily and Aaron stayed in contact after their first meeting. At first the conversations were occasional phone calls and cautious messages, the kind of communication people use when they are still learning how to fit into each other's lives. But as the weeks passed their connection grew more natural. Sometimes Emily would call me after speaking with him and tell me small details about his life that made her smile. He worked as a mechanic in a nearby town, she said, and spent his weekends helping the Harris family maintain their farm. He loved fishing at the same lake where Laura had taken photographs of him years earlier. The more she talked about him, the more I realized that the strange discovery which had once felt like a betrayal was slowly transforming into something unexpected. One evening about 2 months after our trip to Millfield, Emily invited Aaron to visit the city for the first time. I remember standing in the doorway when he arrived, watching him step into the house where Laura and I had built most of our life together. For a brief moment the situation felt almost surreal, like a missing piece of history quietly returning to its place. Aaron moved through the living room slowly, studying the photographs on the walls and the shelves filled with the objects Laura had collected over the years. When he reached the picture of our wedding day he paused and smiled softly. "She was happy here," he said. Hearing those words from him carried a weight that surprised me. For years I had believed my understanding of Laura's happiness came entirely from the life we shared, but Aaron's presence revealed another side of that story. She had found happiness in both places, even though the balance between them had never been simple. Later that night we sat together at the same kitchen table where I had first opened the metal box and discovered the bank statements. Emily poured coffee while Aaron described a story from his childhood about one of Laura's visits to Millfield. He remembered how she once tried to bake a birthday cake in the Harris kitchen but forgot to add sugar to the batter. They had laughed about it for years afterward, and listening to him describe the memory I could almost see the moment in my mind, Laura standing in a small unfamiliar kitchen, determined to celebrate her son's birthday even though she only had a few hours before driving back to the life she shared with me. At some point during the conversation, Emily reached across the table and placed her hand gently over Aaron's. It was a small gesture, but it carried a quiet meaning that didn't need explanation. They were no longer strangers connected only by a secret. They were siblings discovering each other one story at a time. When the evening finally ended and Aaron prepared to leave, he paused near the door and turned back toward me. His expression held a seriousness that made the room feel still for a moment. He thanked me for coming to Millfield that day instead of turning away from the truth. He said he knew the discovery could have easily led to anger or rejection, and that many people in the same situation might have chosen to pretend the secret didn't exist. I told him the truth had already lived in my house for 12 years in the form of that hidden bank account. Ignoring it any longer would only have meant ignoring the part of Laura that cared enough to build a future for him. After he left, Emily and I stood by the window watching his car disappear down the street. The night air outside was calm, and for the first time since Laura's death the house felt less like a place filled with unanswered questions and more like a place where new connections were quietly beginning. A few days later I returned to the bank one last time with the documents Laura had left behind. The branch manager helped me transfer the remaining balance of the secret account into Aaron's name, exactly as Laura had intended from the beginning. When the paperwork was finished I walked out of the building feeling as though I had finally completed the final step of a promise Laura started long before I knew it existed. On the drive home I thought about how easily the story could have ended differently. The discovery of that bank statement could have hardened my heart. I could have closed the account, ignored the photographs, and convinced myself that Laura's secret erased everything good we had built together. But life rarely fits into simple definitions of betrayal or loyalty. Sometimes the truth reveals that love can exist in complicated shapes we never expect to encounter. That evening I placed the metal box back in the desk drawer where I first found it, but this time it no longer felt like a container of hidden secrets. Instead it felt like the final chapter of a story Laura had been trying to finish in her own quiet way. And every once in a while, when Emily and Aaron visit the house together and their laughter fills the kitchen, I realize that the secret bank account my wife kept for 12 years didn't just hold money. It held the bridge that eventually brought our family together.